Hej och välkomna till På resande fot med konsthistoriepodden. Jag heter Alexandra Frid.
Och jag heter Alexandra Härlitz.
Och som ni vet så har ju vi varit på resa i USA. Nu har vi varit hemma i en månad ungefär. Men vi har fortfarande lite intervjuer och sånt som vi arbetar oss igenom.
Precis, och den sista stationen på vår resa var Boston. Och där var vi på flera av de här stora fantastiska konstmuseer. Bland annat då Museum of Fine Arts.
The Museum of Fine Arts i Boston var ju verkligen ett helt otroligt museum. Kanske det bästa som vi har besökt i USA.
Ja, det tänker jag med. För det var så många konstverk där som man ofta åberopar i föreläsningar. Och sen var det också för min egen del så var det flera konstverk som jag har med i min doktorsavhandling som jag inte hade sett i verkligheten tidigare faktiskt.
Ja, nej, det var helt otroligt. Ett helt otroligt museum. Sen var vi också på The Harvard Museum of Art.
Ja.
Vilket också var ett fantastiskt museum. Men det är inte därför som vi har det här samtalet idag. Utan vi ska ju faktiskt prata om vårt besök på the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum.
Precis, och det är ju så att när man är konstvetare så får man ju vad ska man säga? Man har ju vissa förväntningar när man ska besöka ett museum. Framförallt ett museum som är så omskriven och omtalat som the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Ibland så infrias de här förväntningarna inte riktigt. Vi hade ju sett både förstås fotografier av museet och vi hade sett hur museet ser ut i dokumentärer.
Och framförallt läst om Isabella Stewart Gardner, hennes roll som mecenat i USA och Europa.
Och hennes samling. Ja. Och när vi kom dit, ja, hur var intrycket då? det var ju lite, för det första var det väldigt välbesökt. Det var så mycket folk som på inget annat museum, tror jag.
Ja, men det håller jag nog med om, att det var ganska trångt.
Ja, mycket folk som rörde sig där och det var generellt ganska svårt att navigera där för det finns ju inga etiketter på väggarna som säga någonting om de utställda konstverken. Det finns
ingen informationstext heller om hur man ska röra sig i samlingen.
Nej.
Och när man kommer in så är det ju som ett sammelsurium av olika objekt som är ihopknökade på olika saker. Det är ju både högt och lågt.
och i varje sal, och vissa av dem är ju väldigt små, men där finns det i alla fall en QR-kod som man kan scanna och så får man information på en webbsida. Men på denna webbsida så får man inga bilder av de konstverken.
Det är som en lista.
Ja, det är som en lista, en numrerad lista. Ja. Och så står det ofta information som att det är ett oidentifierat verk eller av en oidentifierad konstnär. Så den informationen man får där, den är också väldigt sparsmakad kan man säga. Och detta då i kombination med att det är många okända verk och ja, det gör det väldigt svårt att navigera där i denna samling, att få kunskap eller att veta vad det är man ser ens. Ja,
och då är vi ändå konstvetare.
Ja.
Däremot så är ju själva miljön fantastisk såklart. Det är ju, hon har ju valt att bygga det här museet ungefär som en italiensk renässansvilla ungefär.
Ja, ja.
Och det var 3 utställningsvåningar här för mig att det var.
Ja, det var det. Ja. Som ett renässanspalats.
Ja, precis, exakt. Men som sagt, helt osorterat.
Ja.
Och när vi kom hem från USA-resan så hade vi en inplanerad intervju med intendenten Diana Seave Greenwald på Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Och då fick vi i alla fall möjlighet att ställa frågor om samlingen men också hängningen och hur de tänker forskningsmässigt men också pedagogiskt på museet.
Jag tycker vi ska lyssna på henne nu.
So again, thank you so much for having this interview with us. So as Gardner's latest biographer, was there anything that surprised you in your research?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot that's surprising. I think the most important kind of insight for me, well, one of the most important insights for me was that she is so specific in limiting what archival record is kind of left behind her, right? Like what became clear, and when you read the earlier biography, is that there's a lot of myth that swirls around her, and that's on purpose. It's not something that's an accident. She's kind of courting it. She's specifically withholding information about why she does what she does. She's not very specific about any kind of clear political views. She doesn't say why the museum looks the way it does. She actually, in some cases, there's fairly limited photography of her, especially as she gets more famous, which is really fascinating. And so I think the thing that surprised me most is how much I was, along with my co-author, Nat Silver, trying to write a biography of someone who almost specifically made it hard to write a biography about them.
So why do you think there are less photographs of her as she becomes more famous?
That's a great question. Actually, we have an exhibition opening in a month, exactly, that called Inventing Isabella, which deals with some of these issues. I think that she understood that her image was a precious resource in a way that, you know, now a general public is understanding in the age of social media. But like with many things, she was at the vanguard. And it's really interesting because even in the press, there's this amazing like series of complaints that there are no photographs available of her. So I think she knew it was a precious resource. I think she knew it could really communicate things to the broader public. And so rather than, you know, let herself be captured in candid photographs or even use photography primarily, I think she actually preferred working with artists. So most notably John Singer Sargent in 1888, and of course Anders Zorn in 1894. Although there are other kind of Zorn collaborations earlier, including a series of prints. And when working with artists, she could really communicate specific things about herself that I think photography, at least in the moment where she's having these portraits made, is not perhaps quite there yet. So with Sargent, it is almost like she's a religious figure, an idol with a halo, or by some readings, almost like a bodhisattva, lotus patterns behind her head. And with Zorn, he really captures that kind of vivaciousness that she was so famous for. Also, she looks very youthful for someone who is 54 years old at the time.
You already said that she liked to establish her own myth. Can you tell us something about, I mean, her position in American art history and the position of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in the American museum landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think she plays a couple of different roles in both American art and in the history of the museum landscape. Perhaps first and foremost and clearest, it's as an art collector. You know, she, whether it was being a really early collector of major Italian Renaissance art, I mean, we had the first Botticelli in America, the first Raphael in America, working with Bernard Berenson, her closest art advisor, she really paves the way for what would come to populate major American museums, and she's doing it earlier. And she works really closely with major American artists or artists active in the United States. Again, Sargent, Zorn, you know, she believes in sponsoring and actually being friends with American artists. And I should say that's across media. It is painters, but it's also musicians and playwrights and dance. I mean, she really is a pioneering patron of the arts. The fact that she's a woman stands out, you know, in terms of the landscape of other museum builders and art patrons. You know, often people think of our kind of peer institutions as the Frick in New York, Henry Clay Frick, or the Morgan Library, founded by J.P. Morgan. First of all, these are actually slightly later institutions, so she's kind of ahead of the game, but also they're founded by men. And so she's really, along with the Hewitt sisters who founded the Cooper Hewitt, one of the only kind of 19th century women to really build an institution. And our museum is the first kind of purpose-built museum built by a woman. I should add the Cooper Hewitt starts actually in Cooper Union in a university as kind of like a usable collection. And so I think the last thing, which is so important, and I really think we're only just starting to understand, is she presents a model of a museum that is absolutely the opposite of the encyclopedic model that is, really pioneered by the Met, by the MFA, not pioneered, I mean, it's really based on European models, but is used by the Met, is used by the MFA Boston. And that's very much, I will present to you a history of art divided by geography and time period and often medium. Like, she just explodes that. And our museum is the opposite of a rigid didactic encyclopedic model. It is experiential. It mixes works from all over the world, from all sorts of different time periods. I mean, I think for me, one of the most emblematic examples is that she puts the fabric of her own dress, designed by Charles Frederick Worth, underneath our Titian, which is one of the most important Renaissance paintings in America. And to hang them on the same wall, exactly next to each other, is a really bold move. And yeah, I admire it.
When we were at the museum, we saw the hanging of the artworks. Is it much different from the time when she opened the collection?
It's a great question. And so we're governed by a will that when she died in 1924, we could make no permanent alterations to the installations. So the installations are as she left them in 1924. There are, for example, the Titian room that I mentioned, a lot of the fabrics and wall hangings actually degraded within a few years or a decade or two of her death. And so there had been replacements, and we've done a lot of work with full gallery restoration projects to make sure that it looks like what she had. But we really do hew to what she presented, and we are stable in that way. What I will say, though, is that during her lifetime, the museum did change. So we opened in 1903. Construction started in 1899. The whole last year of the construction process was her arranging things in the gallery, and she changed things during her lifetime. So one of my favorite paintings in the collection, which is Edouard Manet's portrait of his mother, is currently in our Blue Room. When she first purchased it and put it on display, it actually was on an easel in our long gallery. And so she changed things, but we don't.
You already mentioned that she paved the way and established, in a way, the art historical canon for the American art museums. Do you know anything about the criteria of her art collection? It sounded as if we don't know how she started to collect art or how she chose works of art that she wanted to buy and have in her collection. Do we know anything about her collection? And do we know, she collected both historical art from the Renaissance, but also contemporary art. And are there differences between how she collected or how she chose works of art?
No, that's a great question. So we do know, so one of the best sources we have available, actually, let me back up. We do know some things about why she collected certain things and how she got into collecting. A kind of very brief summary is she lived through quite a bit of personal tragedy early in life. She and her husband struggled to have children. They had one child who sadly passed away before he was 2. And it was made clear to her, in her late 20s that, she wasn't going to do the job of many 19th century women, which was to have a biological family, right? To have kids. And so she and her husband started traveling the world. They traveled to, if you use today's borders, 39 countries between 1867 and the 1890s. And so really the beginning of kind of her education and some of the earliest things that come in that are in our collection were gathered on those trips. Now, those are really small things like Chinese snuff bottles, a Norwegian Hanseatic beaker that she bought in 1867. So there are small things that start that way. In the 1880s, she starts auditing classes at Harvard and takes art history and Italian culture classes. She actually joins the Dante Club. She gets really into Dante, and rare book collecting, particularly volumes of Dante, is kind of her gateway drug to art collecting. And it's also at Harvard in the 1880s where she meets a then very young Bernard Berenson, who would go on to become a leading art connoisseur. It's a pretty touching story. The two of them, Berenson was Jewish. He was actually passed over for a traveling fellowship to Europe because the art history professor at the time, Charles Eliot Norton, was a pretty rabid anti-Semite. Mm-hmm. And so they passed over Berenson, but Gardner and 2 other friends put money together to send Berenson to Europe. And about a decade later, Berenson comes back. He's written his first book. He sends it to her and they reconnect. And it's really her taste, particularly in Italian art, is really forged in conjunction with Berenson. Now, keep in mind, she does buy some things that are really important on her own. In the 1890s, early 1890s, she bought the concert by Johannes Vermeer, and she was in Paris in the auction room giving instructions. But often a lot of the collection was recommendations from Berenson or other advisors, a photograph, a description, and a letter. And it's through that, it's actually across a distance that she decides what to buy or not. That's a lot of the historic collection. The contemporary collection works a little bit differently. She became friends with Sargent after he painted her portrait. She was an early client of his, and she would go on to just kind of keep purchasing things by him. Other friends of hers, like Anders Zorn, there's that wonderful story about how the two of them met at the World's Fair in Chicago. And she says, we're going to be like great friends or great enemies. And so I think the contemporary art collecting is a little bit more based on her friendships with artists, while the historic collecting is often her taking the advice, but absolutely making her own decisions. I mean, she turns down any number of things that Berenson proposes in conversation with experts, which is also really new at the time, that she basically had an art advisor, and now every contemporary collector has an art advisor, but she really had one of the best right at the beginning.
And when we visited the museum or the collection, we noticed that, I mean, she has some extraordinary pieces and then she has less extraordinary pieces. And it kind of got us wondering, like, why did she collect so broadly? Do you know?
I think she liked what she liked. I also think we have something that I love about the Gardner, and in my other life as an academic, I actually work with statistics in art history to study canon formation. And what I love about the Gardner is it shows you something that you can also show with numbers, which is that people collect. I mean, first of all, the art that was made versus what's in museums now is like a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of what was ever produced. And many collectors collected very broadly. It's just that the museums that they then gave art to were only interested in a handful of things. Yeah. So either they would only select a part of a donation, right? Or they would only take the oil paintings, or the rest of that collection is in a basement somewhere. So Gardner collected a lot of lace, right? And I really hope that this is correct. But some curator from the Baltimore Museum of Art can tell me if it's different. I believe the Cohn sisters were famous modernist collectors who gave their collection to the Baltimore Museum of Art, also collected a ton of lace. But we don't necessarily focus on that. I actually think while how eclectic her collection is, how global it is a standout, it's a little bit less of a standout than we really understand, because now we only see highly curated parts of collections in museums that have an encyclopedic model and have been filtering those collections, for decades.
It was a bit difficult to navigate in the museum as there were no labels on the artworks, and when you opened this QR codes, I mean, it wasn't easy to identify what information belongs to what work of art, and many of them were unidentified artists. Is this something you are researching on at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum? What kind of works of art do we have? And
no, it's a great question. So the first thing is the no labels is actually, again, an Isabella legacy thing, right? So for us to go and put tombstones on everything would represent a permanent change to her displays. We are undertaking a massive cataloging effort in an interesting way, the same way I described how other museum collections would only take the star oil paintings, let's say, or sculptures. You can see that historical bias a little bit in our cataloging, because if you were to look at the Carlo Crivelli, very clearly identified, there's lots of information. But if you were to look at one of my favorites, which is one really odd, which is a pine cone that she placed on top of a piece of driftwood in the courtyard, we don't know very much at all. And so now we are really focused on growing our information about all of those small things, all of those lesser known things. Our archives, we actually have these kind of cases in the galleries, which she put archives into, and so we consider that our collection as well. So we have north of 20,000 objects from all sorts of areas, and we are definitely working on it. I'd say something that's a real focus at the moment is that Gardner was a pretty early collector of non-Western art as well. Historic Chinese art, of Japanese art. We have some actually amazing Islamic art. And we now, as of last year, our assistant curator is a Chinese art expert. So we have that expertise on staff. And we have a program of bringing in visiting scholars and curators to help us look at the collection, because I'm a 19th century Americanist by training. So I'm useless when you need me to catalog what's one of my favorites. There's a roof tile. It's actually next to a Zorn. There's a Japanese roof tile with like a pigeon sculpture.
I mean, we know that she collected her friends like Sargent and also Zorn and Whistler, right? But did she collect other American artists like contemporary artists at the time? I'm thinking, George O'Keeffe was starting to sort of make it in the early 20th century, and
so it's interesting. She is like very much a 19th century person. So she does collect other American artists, right? So, we have John Lafarge in the collection, for example. We have Anna Hyatt Huntington, who's an American sculptor. Dodge McKnight, who's a friend of hers, who maybe not my favorite watercolors, but we have a lot of it. So there are other American artists in the collection. There's not a lot of American modernism. The most kind of modern American art we have is actually a set of photographs by Edward Steichen. She has an issue of camera work that was given to her. But our most kind of radical pieces, you could say, are Matisse, which is French, but we have a Matisse painting and several drawings, and those were gifts. So I think on the whole, she doesn't seem to have had a huge active interest in early 20th, in sort of American modernism, but there is some of it, and she was open to it. And interestingly, that Matisse, which was given to her by a friend and was placed on long-term loan, and then she officially accepted, I think in 22, but anyway, certainly not too long before her death, is one of the earliest Matisses to enter an American museum collection. So, even if she's not actively pursuing it, she's really in a milieu that's helping her, introducing her to all sorts of new art.
You already mentioned the friendships between her and Singer Sargent and Zorn. And I mean, this is something that sometimes in art history, at least in Europe, has been, the amicable terms of the relationship have been sometimes a bit exaggerated. And what do you think about these relationships she had with these artists? Were they really friends, or is there some kind of clear distinction between the patron and the artist?
It's a good question, and I think it depends on the artist and the duration of their relationship together. I think Sargent, it's very much like a patron relationship at first, and he actually says some kind of catty things about her at the beginning, and it's like they spend a very long set of sittings. I think it's nearly 2 months. And apparently she can't stop turning her head to look away, and it's annoying him. And, it's not, and she has opinions. She has really strong opinions, which he's not totally used to among his portrait sitters. But by the end of their life, I really think they're genuinely friends. And for me, the most poignant example of that is we have this late watercolor. Gardner had a stroke in 1919 that was pretty debilitating. I mean, she was partially paralyzed. She really stopped going out in public. And she let Sargent paint her like that. We have this gorgeous watercolor from just a couple of years before her death called Mrs. Gardner in White. Sargent had given up portrait painting by then. He was bored of it and didn't want to do it. He would only really paint friends and family. And so I think the vulnerability for someone as proud as she was, who so tightly controlled her image, to let someone show her in a diminished state, and for Sargent to be interested in doing that for his friend, I think is is a genuine testament to friendship. But, it's also, in a way, take someone like Bernard Berenson, who's helping kind of send all this art to her. I know he's not an artist, but he's like a main source. Of course, there's tension because there's money being exchanged. And he's making money off of sales to her, and that annoys her. She wants it to be like kind of pure. And of course it's not, because it's commerce. And you can imagine with the artists, that's kind of the same thing. But, by the time Sargent's painting her in the 20s, he's quite rich himself, doesn't really need, he's in a position where he can paint her for free and for the kind of emotion of it.
So what do you think about the relationship between her and Zorn? You looked at a lot of Zorn, but we were a little bit disappointed when we looked at the portrait that she had made of her, because in pictures it looks grand, and she looks fabulous, but in real life it wasn't quite like that. The light is a little bit off. It's not as striking as one would imagine. Like,
I think it's a lot the dimensions that were striking.
You thought it would be bigger?
Yeah, we thought it would be bigger, because this is the impression you get when you have a look at it in the books.
Well, I think it's funny because I think it all depends on your expectations before you come in. So I think if you were to ask an American, they'd be like, "Oh, that's a fabulous portrait," but they have forgive me, but they rarely know who Anders Zorn was. So they're just like blown away by it. I think if you've seen it a lot, but yeah, it's in a slightly surprising place. Lighting is always a challenge at the Gardner. The museum did have electricity when it opened, but for a variety of reasons, it was often lit by natural light. And we're actually just starting to relight, not just starting, that's not true. We're about like 70% through installing modern track in the museum, so people can actually like see the art, because we don't leave the shades open when on public hours, which is what Gardner did. The short gallery is kind of an odd space. It is a little small and tight. It's a bit of a homage to the family. It's the only portrait of Jack is kind of by Mancini, is kind of up and to the left of her. There's a Tomaselli portrait of her beloved grandmother across the way. So I think some of the decision to put it there is, and again, this is conjecture, but it seems to be linked to trying to create kind of a family moment in this particular corner. The other thing about that Zorn portrait, which I think is kind of important to highlight, is he was working on a different portrait scheme for much longer and in person when he was in Boston. So he created a series of studies, and then he created etchings of Isabella as kind of a Renaissance queen. She's in like a very grand chair. She's wearing an elaborate headpiece. She's draped in furs. And he made this print, in theory, I think, to distribute to friends, right? Kind of an image control thing. And we have pretty much all the copies still in the museum. And so I think she didn't like it. And the plate was canceled. We also have one print off of the canceled plate. Yeah. And so, and, she looks a little bit older there, right? And I think the Zorn portrait, which is very free and came together much more quickly, is kind of take two. So in a way, it's not like the Sargent, which was the thing. They spent 2 months of sittings doing that. The Zorn was a faster production, and it was also I think a bit of an answer to the first attempt that didn't go so well. So, you think about what the goals were, but what I appreciate about it, as opposed to the Sargent, is it has a lot more movement to it, I think. I think to handle something that freely, it's actually quite hard it would be harder to do it on a much bigger scale than it is. But
Well, his portraits usually are a bit bigger in dimensions. I think this is why you react as a Swede who is acquainted with his other portraits.
What's it like working with such a legacy and such an important collection?
It's a privilege, I think I often joke that I'm the curator of the collection, but really Isabella is my chief curator. And the other thing that's really interesting is we have a modern wing. We do special exhibitions. We do loan our collection. We do 3 loans a year. And then sometimes we'll move parts of our permanent collection into the modern wing and build a show around them. It's really interesting to be a curator who has to create shows in conversation with the palace, our historic building, because it's such an overwhelming, rich experience. And so it's been really clarifying for me that in some cases, what works best in a white cube gallery, I mean, because the palace is the opposite of it, is like a really clear, tight argument about, or like really that rich information that isn't on the walls because we don't have labels, that our ability to kind of interpret the collection in these like kind of highlight ways in our special exhibitions gallery is also really exciting. And it's just a really cool place to come to work each day. I think she was onto something with museums being experiential. More and more museums are trying to create moments where, you know, you see these art and bloom programs where they put cut flowers in the galleries. They have musical performances in the galleries. This is all stuff she was doing in 1903. And I think it's paying off. Our attendance is, our new building was built for, I think, about 250,000 people a year. And now we're north of 400,000. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is because people love the experience. Mm-hmm. You just kind of come in and can just feel it. And that was quite a radical decision that's proven to be, I think, a really prescient one.
Thank you so much.
It was so nice meeting you, and thank you so much for taking the time to
Thank you.
Ja, det var ju väldigt intressant att få höra henne berätta om hur det är att vara curator på ett sånt museum som the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. För man har ju inte riktigt så fria händer som man trodde, utan mycket finns ju styrd av den här testamentariska önskan av Isabella Stewart Gardner att ingenting får förändras i de här samlingarna.
Just det måste vara jättesvårt att förhålla sig till som en modern curator.
Och Isabella Stewart Gardner, hon verkar ju vara en väldigt intressant person. Det hörde vi ju lite om nu i intervjun.
Diana har ju varit med och skrivit den senaste biografin om Isabella Stewart Gardner. Vi närmar oss ju säsongstart, eller säsongpremiär av säsong 3.
Säsong 4.
Är det säsong 4?
Ja!
Hjälp! Men herregud, redan säsong 4. Måndag den 2 oktober klockan 13 så släpper vi första avsnittet av säsong 4.
Det gör vi. Och det ska bli så spännande vad det blir för verk.
Ja, det är ett spännande verk.
Men vad det blir, det får ni höra då.
Hej då.
Hej då.